Excuse me, but I requested the premium champagne.
Sir, we are currently experiencing turbulence.
I do not see any turbulence.
The silence at 40,000 feet is never really silent. It is a low, constant hum of twin engines, the faint hiss of pressurized air, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of 200 strangers trapped in a metal tube. But on Flight 414, bound from Denver to Seattle, that silence was shattered by the sound of laughter, cruel, sharp, and deliberate. It came from row 4, where 3 young men in expensive jackets were leaning back, tossing crumpled pretzel wrappers over their shoulders. Every single one of those wrappers landed on the lap of the girl sitting alone in seat 5A. She did not flinch. She did not brush the trash off her skirt. She just kept her eyes fixed on the small oval window, watching the sea of clouds drift beneath the wing. Her name was Maya, though no one on that plane knew it, and to the 3 college athletes sitting in front of her, she was nothing more than an easy target. She wore a faded gray sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, worn-out canvas shoes, and had a thick, weathered leather binder tucked tightly under her arm. To anyone looking at her, she looked like a quiet, overwhelmed freshman heading off to a state college, completely out of her depth. "Hey, 5A," one of the boys sneered, turning around in his seat and resting his elbows on her headrest. "Did your counselor forget to tell you that first class is for people who can actually afford the ticket? Or did you sneak back here when the gate agent wasn't looking?" His friends chuckled, looking around the cabin to see if anyone was watching. A few passengers glanced up from their phones, felt the familiar sting of uncomfortable tension, and quickly looked away. Maya didn't answer. She simply reached down, picked up the binder, and held it closer to her chest. Her knuckles were pale, but her hands were steady. Unbelievably steady. If the boys had looked closer, they might have noticed the tiny, precise scars tracing the base of her thumbs, or the way her eyes scanned the horizon outside, not with the wonder of a nervous passenger, but with the calculated glance of someone measuring altitude, drift, and cloud density. "Leave her alone, Marcus," a middle-aged woman across the aisle murmured softly. Marcus just smirked, running a hand through his hair. "Just offering some friendly advice, ma'am. Some people don't belong in certain seats." The flight attendant came down the aisle with the drink cart, offering a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. She handed Marcus a soda, gave his friends their drinks, and then turned to Maya. "Anything for you, sweetie?" "Just water, please," Maya said. Her voice was surprisingly deep, calm, and utterly devoid of tremor. Marcus snorted. "Water. Figures." What Marcus didn't know, what no one in that cabin knew, was that 6 months ago, Maya wasn't sitting in a commercial airliner. She was sitting in the cockpit of an F-35 Lightning II over the gray, icy waters of the North Pacific. He didn't know that the leather binder she held wasn't a school notebook, but a flight log containing 300 combat flight hours, 2 tactical commendations, and a medal she had buried in the bottom of her duffel bag because looking at it made her chest ache. He didn't know that 3 months ago, during a joint training exercise in extreme weather, her wingman, her younger brother, Leo, had suffered an engine flameout in heavy wind shear. She had broken formation, dived through an illegal cloud deck to stay with him, and guided his dead stick landing onto a pitch-black carrier deck. She had saved his life, but the high G turn she took to pull out of the dive had damaged the nerves in her right inner ear. The military medical board had been swift and unyielding. Grounded. Temporarily unfit for high G tactical flight. Reassigned to reserve status pending quarterly evaluation. To Maya, being grounded felt like having her lungs stolen. She was 19 when she entered the academy, 22 when she took her first combat posting. Flying wasn't just her career, it was the only language she knew how to speak fluently. Deprived of the sky, she felt hollowed out, floating through a life that moved too slowly. She was on this flight traveling to a specialized civilian nerve clinic in Seattle, holding on to the faint, fragile hope that a civilian surgeon might clear her to fly again. The aircraft gave a sudden, hard lurch. It wasn't the gentle bump of ordinary air turbulence. It was a violent, lateral drop that forced the overhead bins to creak and sent several plastic cups sliding across trays. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a loud, metallic chime. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice of Captain Thomas came over the intercom, sounding strained and tight. "We've encountered some unforecasted wind shear near the mountain range. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, please take your jump seats immediately." Marcus rolled his eyes and took a sip of his soda, but his knuckles gripped his armrest just a little bit tighter. Great. A little bump. Pilots probably don't even know how to handle basic mountain waves. Maya glanced out the window. Her eyes narrowed. The cloud tops weren't soft and fluffy anymore, they were violent, jagged anvil structures rising rapidly into the stratosphere. A wall of severe convective activity was building, hidden behind the high-altitude cirrus layer. The plane rocked again, harder this time, dropping 50 feet in a fraction of a second. Then came the sound that no aviator ever wants to hear. It wasn't a bang. It was a deep, resonant thunk, followed immediately by an unnatural, high-pitched screeching sound from the right wing. The floor beneath their feet began to vibrate violently, a high-frequency tremor that vibrated right through the soles of their shoes. The main cabin lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the dull, orange glow of emergency seating lights. In row 4, Marcus's smug expression vanished, replaced instantly by a pale, wide-eyed terror. "What was that?" he gasped, looking at his friends. "Hey, what was that?" Maya didn't panic. She closed her eyes for 1 second, took a slow breath in through her nose, and listened. She didn't listen like a terrified passenger, she listened like a technician analyzing a failure mode. Engine 2. Compressors stalling. Thermal shock or bird strike at altitude. She opened her eyes, looked out the right window, and watched as a thin trail of dark gray smoke spiraled out from the cowling of the right engine. The aircraft violently yawed to the right, dipping its wing dangerously low as the asymmetric thrust pulled the plane out of balanced flight. Passengers began to scream. Trays slammed shut, books dropped to the carpet, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling panels with a loud, mechanical snap, dangling like thin plastic vines above their heads. Over the cabin speakers, the open mic picked up heavy, labored breathing. It wasn't an announcement. Someone in the flight deck had left the interphone keyed by mistake. "Compressor stall, losing hydraulic pressure in System A," a voice yelled. It was the first officer. "I've got the yoke. Apply manual rudder, hard left." Captain Thomas's voice was tense, laced with an edge of control that was rapidly slipping. "The control cables aren't responding right, we've got a cross-wind shear hitting 50 knots from the ridge. Captain, the mountain peak is 12,000. We're sinking at 3,000 feet per minute." The audio snapped off. Panic exploded in the cabin. The flight attendant near the front was strapped into her jump seat, her face completely drained of color as she tried to yell instructions over the roar of the wind and the crying of children. Marcus had tucked his head into his knees, his hands trembling violently, muttering prayers under his breath. Maya pulled off her seatbelt. She stood up instantly. The plane jolted, sending her briefly off balance, but she caught herself on the overhead bin with absolute composure. She pulled the oxygen mask out of her way and stepped out into the aisle. "Hey! What are you doing?" Marcus screamed up at her, his voice crackling with sheer panic. "Sit down. You're gonna get killed." Maya didn't even look down at him. She walked straight down the center aisle toward the forward galley, her steps deliberate and measured, compensating for the violent rolling of the fuselage with practiced shipboard balance. She reached the cockpit door and knocked firmly 3 times, the standard military signal for an emergency entry attempt, then pressed her ear against the security panel. Through the thick door, she heard the frantic chime of multiple master caution alarms. She grabbed the interphone handset off the wall, punched in the emergency flight deck code, and lifted the receiver. "Cockpit, this is seat 5A, Maya said. Her voice was ice cold, perfectly level, carrying the sharp authority of a military frequency callout. I am a qualified jet aviator. I hear your asymmetric thrust and hydraulic degradation. Do you require immediate flight deck assistance? There was a 3-second pause on the line. The cabin was screaming behind her, the plane pitched down at an aggressive 12-degree angle, and the clouds outside were turning pitch black as they plunged into the heart of the storm cell. The lock on the cockpit door clicked. The door swung open 6 inches. First Officer Miller, a young man whose forehead was slick with sweat and blood from a loose item that had struck him during the initial drop, looked out at her. His eyes were wide with desperation. Behind him, Captain Thomas was pulling back on the control column with both hands, his arm muscles straining against the hydraulic resistance. "Who are you?" Miller shouted over the blare of the stall warning horn, "Beep beep beep, pitch up." "You're a kid." "Lieutenant Maya Vance, United States Navy," she answered instantly, stepping into the narrow doorway. 300 hours in single-seat tactical jets. Qualified on multi-axis fly-by-wire and emergency manual reversion landing protocols. Your right engine is seized, your hydraulic loop is failing, and you're fighting a severe mountain wave downdraft. You are over-controlling the yoke. Captain Thomas glanced back over his shoulder for a split second. His face was gray with fatigue and shock. Her right ear, she's got a flight binder. God help us. Get in here. Miller, get in the jump seat and handle the checklists, my rudder pedal cable just snapped. Without a moment of hesitation, Maya stepped into the cockpit. She didn't ask permission. She didn't pause to express fear. She took the left-hand captain's seat as Captain Thomas shifted his weight to maintain pressure on the surviving control inputs. She strapped herself into the 4-point harness with movements so fast they were a blur of muscle memory. She adjusted the headset, slapped it over her ears, and immediately swept her eyes across the glass cockpit instruments. Primary flight display, airspeed 210 knots and dropping. Altitude 9,400 feet. Vertical speed indicator, 2,800 feet per minute. Ground clearance over the Cascades, less than 2,000 feet. Checklist, Maya commanded sharply, her fingers instantly flipping 3 guarded switches on the overhead panel to isolate the failing hydraulic loop. Miller, report left engine status. Left engine is at 92%, but it's overheating from the load. Miller stammered, his hands shaking as he swiped through the digital flight manual. Reduce thrust on engine 1 to 85%, Maya ordered calmly. Reduce thrust? Captain Thomas yelled. We're sinking into a mountain. If you cook the only good engine, we turn into a 100-ton glider in 30 seconds, Maya snapped, her tone carrying such raw, unyielding command that Thomas instantly froze. We trade altitude for airspeed. Pitch down 5 degrees. We'll hit the ridge. We won't hit the ridge if we catch the updraft on the windward side of the peak, Maya said, her eyes locked on the digital terrain map on the navigation screen. I've flown terrain following missions in these exact mountains during winter storms. The wind is coming from 280 degrees at 60 knots. It's slamming against the western face of Mount Rainier's foothill ridge and bouncing up. If we ride the updraft, we gain lift without burning out the left turbine. Captain Thomas looked at the 19-year-old girl sitting in his seat. In her eyes, there was no fear, no doubt, no panic. There was only pure, mathematical calculation and an absolute, terrifying mastery of the air. Do it, Thomas breathed. Maya took the control stick. The moment her fingers closed around the rubber grip, the constant ache in her spirit vanished. The inner ear damage, the shame of being grounded, the mocking words of the boys in row 4, all of it dissolved into thin air. She wasn't a broken veteran on her way to a clinic. She was a pilot. And the sky, no matter how violent, was her domain. She pushed the yoke forward. In the cabin, the passengers shrieked as the nose of the plane dropped lower, pointing directly into the dark, swirling vortex of storm clouds and jagged gray rock outcroppings emerging through the mist. In seat 4A, Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the armrests so hard his fingers bled. "We're going to crash. We're going to crash," he wept openly, all his arrogant posture completely reduced to ash. Inside the cockpit, Maya watched the altimeter unspool rapidly. 8,000 feet. 7,500 feet. 7,000 feet. Ground proximity warning, the automated voice barked inside the cockpit. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. Hold your input, Maya said softly to herself, her thumb hovering over the trim switch. She was feeling the air frame through the control surfaces, sensing the subtle shift in pressure against the wings. Wait for it. Suddenly, a massive wall of updraft air hit the underside of the fuselage. The entire airplane groaned under the immense structural stress, but instead of sinking, the rate of climb needle violently reversed. The aircraft was lifted straight upward on an invisible cushion of mountain wind. Now, Maya shouted. Thrust to maximum on engine 1. Smooth application. Right rudder trim, full left wing drop 3 degrees to arrest the roll. She pulled back on the yoke with smooth, fluid precision. The airliner sliced through the crest of the storm cloud, bursting into a pocket of clear, golden sunlight just 300 feet above the jagged granite pine-covered ridge. The plane banked sharply to the left, slipping parallel to the mountain range, safe from the downdraft zone. Miller let out a long, ragged breath, letting his head fall back against his headrest. My God, we cleared it. We cleared the peak. We aren't home yet, Maya said, her eyes already scanning the secondary systems screen. We have no main hydraulic control for the starboard landing gear, and our fuel balance is shifting right because of the ruptured line. We have one shot at a dead stick, single-engine approach into Seattle-Tacoma. She keyed the radio transmitter. Seattle Center, this is Flight 414 Heavy, declaring an emergency. Declaring Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have lost engine 2, hydraulic system A degraded, structural damage to starboard wing root. Request immediate priority vector for runway 16 left, full crash rescue response on standby. Flight 414 Heavy, Seattle Center, radio loud and clear, the controller's tense voice returned instantly. You are cleared for direct approach, cleared all airspace. Radar contact confirmed. Godspeed. For the next 20 minutes, the silence inside the flight deck was broken only by Maya's clear, methodical callouts. She flew the massive airliner not with brute force, but with delicate, micro-adjustments, compensating for the lost rudder control by using subtle throttle changes on the single working engine. She nursed the wounded bird down through the lower soup of Seattle's rain clouds, aligning the nose perfectly with the bright green and white approach lights of the runway ahead. Landing gear dropping manually, Captain Thomas reported, pulling the emergency extension lever. A loud clunk-clunk echoed through the floorboards as the main gear fell into place under their own weight. But the cockpit display showed only 2 green lights. The right main gear was stuck halfway down, unlatched. Right gear isn't locked, Miller shouted. If we touch down like that, the wing will scrape, catch fire, and flip the plane. Maya didn't blink. I'll slam the left main down hard on touchdown to break our descent, then use aerodynamic braking to keep the right wing high as long as possible. When the speed drops below 60 knots, I'll drop the right side and let the emergency friction pad take the load. Captain, as soon as we make contact, hit the fire suppression bottles on engine 2. Understood, Thomas said, looking at her with profound awe. The runway threshold flashed beneath the nose. 500 feet. 200 feet. 50 feet. The wind swept across the tarmac, threatening to push the tail around, but Maya kept the nose pointed dead down the centerline. 10 feet. She pulled the nose up slightly, flaring the aircraft. Thump. The left main gear slammed onto the wet concrete with a sharp puff of tire smoke. Maya instantly applied full left aileron, keeping the right wing tilted up into the air, riding the single gear down the runway like a tightrope walker balancing on a wire. The plane rolled down the runway at 140 miles per hour on one set of tires, smoke billowing, rescue vehicles racing parallel along the taxiways with lights flashing crimson and blue. As the forward momentum finally bled off to 40 knots, the right wing gently settled down. The partially extended gear crumpled with a grinding crunch of metal, but the reinforced structural skid caught the asphalt, throwing a massive spray of yellow sparks into the rainy afternoon air before the airplane ground to a safe, complete stop right in the middle of the runway. Silence filled the cockpit. "Engine 1 cut," Maya murmured calmly, flipping the final master fuel valve. "Fire bottles discharged. Evacuation not required, structural integrity intact. Emergency services are alongside." Captain Thomas sat back in his seat, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't unbuckle his harness. He looked over at Maya. She was already unstrapping herself, her expression as tranquil as a calm lake. Who are you really, kid?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking with intense emotion. Maya offered a small, tired smile, picking up her leather binder from the floor. "Lieutenant Maya Vance. Tactical Fighter Squadron 115. Just trying to make my appointment in Seattle." The cockpit door swung open wide. The head flight attendant was standing there, tears streaming down her face, looking at the two veteran pilots and the young girl standing between them in her oversized gray sweatshirt. Is everyone okay?" the attendant whispered. "Everyone is alive," Captain Thomas said, his voice echoing out into the main cabin through the open door. "Because of her." The flight attendant looked at Maya, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the passenger cabin. She grabbed the public address microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the attendant's voice vibrated over the cabin speakers, crying openly now. "We have safely landed. Please remain seated. I want to inform you that our flight deck crew suffered an unexpected system failure, and the person who just flew this plane and saved all 200 of our lives is sitting right here." Maya stepped out of the cockpit into the front of the cabin, holding her leather binder under her arm. The entire plane went dead silent. Every single eye turned toward the front aisle. There stood the quiet, awkward freshman from seat 5A. In row 4, Marcus was sitting pale and frozen. His mouth dropped open. The two friends sitting beside him looked at Maya, then down at their own hands, their faces burning with a shame so deep it felt suffocating. Marcus looked at the small, pale girl he had called a freeloader, the girl he had thrown trash at, the girl he said didn't belong in first class. Suddenly, an elderly man in row 6 stood up and began to clap. Then a woman holding a baby stood up. Within 3 seconds, the entire cabin exploded into a deafening, standing ovation. Passengers were sobbing, cheering, reaching out their hands to touch her sleeve as she stood there. People were shouting, "Thank you. God bless you," from the back rows. Maya didn't raise her hands or wave. She simply bowed her head politely, a faint, humble blush rising on her cheeks. As she began to walk down the aisle to retrieve her small carry-on bag from the overhead bin in row 5, she stopped right beside seat 4B. Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. He stared down at his shoes, his shoulders slouched, tears of absolute humiliation and gratitude streaming down his cheeks. I'm sorry," Marcus choked out, his voice barely audible over the roaring applause around them. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." Maya stopped. She looked down at him, not with anger, not with smug triumph, but with the quiet, profound wisdom of someone who had faced the cold edge of mortality and conquered it. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled pretzel wrapper that had fallen into her sweater pocket earlier, and gently laid it on his tray table. "It doesn't matter who I am," Maya said softly, her voice carrying clearly over the fading noise of the cabin. "What matters is how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you. Remember that the next time you decide who belongs in what seat." Marcus swallowed hard, unable to say another word, nodding slowly as tears dropped onto the aluminum tray. 10 minutes later, as emergency responders flooded the jet bridge and escorted passengers into the terminal, a senior commander from the Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, who had received an emergency call from Seattle ATC, came marching down the jet bridge in full service dress uniform. He spotted Maya standing near the gate desk, holding her battered binder. The commander walked straight up to her, snapped a sharp, crisp salute, and pulled an official envelope from his breast pocket. "Lieutenant Vance," the commander announced loudly. "The medical board reviewed your latest high-altitude simulation telemetry from last week. The inner ear nerve trauma has completely healed. Your flight status was reinstated 3 hours ago. Commander's orders, report to Naval Air Station Fallon on Monday. Your squadron needs their flight leader back." Maya stared at the envelope. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across her face, the first real smile she had worn in 6 agonizing months. She raised her hand and returned the salute with perfect, razor-sharp precision. "Sir, yes sir," she said. She turned and walked down the long glass concourse of the airport, her footsteps light, her chin held high. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the violent storm clouds were breaking apart, allowing long, golden shafts of afternoon sunlight to pierce through the gray sky, illuminating the endless, open horizon waiting for her return. Never judge a person by the seat they occupy, for true strength is not measured by the status we display to the world, but by the courage we summon when everything around us begins to fall apart.